Okay, you can start the recording. Let me start my session.
Sir, recording has started.
Okay. Okay, so good evening, everybody. What I am going to discuss today is a few important aspects of the Kautilya's Arthashastra and its contemporary relevance. And you had a session arranged by, rather taken by Professor Pulak Mishra the other day. And I shall be just kind of adding up a few more things than what in addition to what he has already dealt with. So as you know, when it comes to dealing with Arthashastra as one of the traditional texts commonly considered as the science of wealth, or to be more precise, we consider to be as the in modern sense as economics, because Science of Wealth, what Adam Smith wrote, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the science of wealth in 1776, that was considered to be the beginning of the field of economics as a branch which was then considered to be a part of political economy, but then gradually it converted into being considered as economics. And then many branches have cropped up in course of time. So, but then in fact, as it has happened to many other such Indian contributions, we have given credit to Adam Smith as the father of, having considered him as the father of economics. And because we thought that the very first book on economics, which has been taken as one of the guiding principles for economics or economists in the later stages, was Adam Smith, and that book was written as in way back in 1776. But then, much before that, there was a book on economics. It was, though it is not just economics, when you try to analyze Arthashastra, it is not about economics only. Though the very term that is used, a Sanskritized term called Arthashastra, it appears that it is all about economics. It is actually not economics only, it is much more than that. It covers various important aspects of a statecraft, including diplomacy, war, peace, intelligence, security, and political economy. And one major thing that we observe when we deal with the Kautilya's Arthashastra, different from the economics that we study today, is that it covered almost all the different aspects of a state's functioning, how a state functions, what are its roles, what would be its role with respect to its neighboring countries, what would be the justice system, what would be the law, the legal system of an economy of a state, what would be the nature of the war, and what kind of conflicts are to be what kind of conflict takes place, and then what kind of strategy you need to adopt when it comes to conflicts between nations or across nations. So it is not that way, it is just not economics, though it is considered to be a kind of a very important piece of work that guides economics even today, though it has not been given as much importance as it deserves. So until date. So that's the reason why we are talking about Kautilya's Arthashastra. So it is better to consider this as a piece of political economy, as a treatise on political economy rather than economics. And in fact, economics as a branch of study was originally considered to be political economy. And even today also, we don't differentiate economics from politics, because it is meaningless to talk about economics, segregating economics from politics, because the political system has a lot to do with the economy or the politics of the time is also guided by the economic prosperity. So that economics and politics are very much intertwined, are very much interlinked. So that way, it is better to consider even today's economics as political economy, as it was originally considered to be, and Arthashastra can be considered as a very good treatise on political economy. So it is, as I said, it is fundamentally a book of state management and a guide to the means of procurement and preservation of wealth, because I'll focus more on the economics aspect of it. So when you look at it as a single piece, though it is not a single piece, there are in fact 15 different chapters which are considered, which are basically 15 different books. And then it deals with various aspects. So, but to be very to be precise, we can say that it fundamentally deals with states management, and it is a guide to the means of procurement and preservation of wealth. Wealth creation, wealth preservation, and wealth promotion, they constitute important components of Arthashastra. And today also it is the same, that when it comes to wealth of an economy, then we need to see how the wealth is to be created, who are the actors to participate, who are the economic agents to participate in the creation of wealth, and then how to preserve the wealth and how to promote it, how we can achieve higher and higher economic growth. And all these directly or indirectly have been captured or have been advocated by Kautilya in his book. And as you know, during Kautilya's era, it was the monarch or the king who was being guided by the ministers, and at that point in time, Kautilya happened to be he was considered to be the prime minister. I mean, as it is claimed that he was the prime minister of Chandragupta Maurya. So he was, in a sense, he was the main actor for framing the principles or guidelines, not only for the citizens, but also for the king. So it was primarily a guide for the king to rule with justice and equity, while ensuring protection and prosperity to his subjects. So, and the book covers both. Kautilya's idea of the statecraft was to provide justice and equity to all, while ensuring protection and prosperity to all the subjects of the monarch. And the text is divided into 15 different chapters, dealing with 3 broad subject matters. One is polity, the other one is economy, the third one is society. And by and large, all the different issues that I talk about, they fit into these 3 different subject matters. These are the major subject matters, I would rather say. And it puts emphasis on 2 broad objectives, the entire book, if I talk about. One is the resource maximization, and the other is the optimal management of the resources. How we can maximize the resources, and then how to optimize the management of the resources. So these are the 2 key objectives of this particular book. And also the book suggests the methods of resource collection, which could bring maximum prosperity without killing the economic incentives. So the incentives are particularly for the producers, if we talk about. While formulating rules and regulations, while formulating policies, which, like suppose it is about the tax policy, it is about the trade policy, we need to ensure that the economic incentives are not sacrificed. So that is also that enough safeguard has been provided in the in this particular book, in the what Kautilya has advocated in his book. So before I discuss what exactly, where does Kautilya's Arthashastra fit in as far as modern economics is concerned, I would like to throw some light on certain key aspects of Kautilya's Arthashastra, because I believe that this is what Professor Mishra has not covered. So I thought that let me also give some idea about certain key aspects of Kautilya's Arthashastra. As I already said, Arthashastra regards the king to be the key, the monarch or the king to be the key in the working of the state administrative machinery. So the king is at the center stage, who looks after the state administration, the education of the princes, and has certain duties to perform, including the selection of ministers and organization of different departments of the state, including justice, taxation, foreign policy, etc. And the ultimate source and the ultimate goal is the prosperity of the kingdom. And there are 4 different upayas, or what you can say the approaches or the ways of realizing the goals or the objectives what Arthashastra suggests. They are Sama, Dana, Bheda, and Danda, which can be translated into conciliation. Sama is conciliation, Dana is gift or giving, Bheda is rupture, discrimination, disparity, but in whatever you look at it. Then Danda is force or army. So these are the 4 upayas, or these are the means of overcoming opposition. And this is based on overlapping in 4 upayas and 6 gunas. There are 6 gunas which are required along with these 4 upayas for the successful diplomacy. And there are 7 prakritis, or the constituent elements of the state, that the book prescribes. They are Swami, the king or the ruler; Amatya, the body of ministers or the structure of administration. That gives a kind of an idea. When I talk about these things, that gives a kind of an idea how during those days a state was functioning. Who are the actors? How they are functioning? What is the relationship among different agents or different departments? So there was a king, there was Amatya, a body of ministers, a structure of administration, what you can see. Then the other constituent element of the state was Janapada or Rashtra, a territory being agricultural, fertile with mines, forests, and pastures. These were the resources then on which the state was dependent upon at that point in time. These are the major resources. And as Kautilya has emphasized, that the major source of income for the state at that point in time was agriculture and fisheries. Though he equally talked about the role of mineral deposits, the mining activities in a state. Then the next one is Durga or Pura or fort. And the one major element of the state was Kosa, or the treasury, what you say in today's context. And the next one is Danda or Bala, which is the army. As I was already telling, this is one of the constituent elements of the state. And
Sir, you have become mute.
I mean, was it muted throughout, or it is muted now?
Only for a few seconds.
I don't know who muted it. I didn't. Okay. So I think you are controlling it. Some of you, one of you is controlling it. I don't know how come someone else is muting it. So please
Sir,
take care.
I am taking care of that, sir.
Yeah, please. So, so these are the seven constituents, constituent elements or seven prakritis which the book talks about. Then there are 6 gunas which I was talking about, 6 formulas of sadgunas, which are basically for the foreign policy. They are sandhi, making a treaty containing conditions or terms, that is the policy of peace, with the other countries of the world or other states. In today's context, we talk about countries. So other states, other territories. Vigraha, the policy of hostility. Not that you have sandhi with everyone. You will have also some states which may not be your allies. They will be your enemies. The policy of hostility, what kind of policy you need to have in place as a part of the diplomacy or the foreign policy. Asana, the policy of remaining quiet, maintaining neutrality. In a sense, you can say it is maintaining neutrality, not planning to march on an expedition or to wait and watch. Yana, marching on an expedition. And then samsraya, seeking shelter with another king or in a fort. So these, and then the last one is dvibhava, that is the double policy of sandhi with one king and vigraha with another at the same time. And that is quite common in today's context. All the 5 gunas, 6 gunas I talked about, they're quite common in today's context. You see that the today's world economic order or social or the diplomatic order has become such that it is very difficult to understand who is your ally and who is your enemy, with whom, what kind of a relationship you are maintaining, whether it is sacrosanct, whether it is, it is something that is temporary in nature, maybe as time passes by, you create new allies and all that, as you keep observing in today's context. So that is what even Kautilya advocated long back. And that is what was in practice then. The general rule is that when one is weaker than the enemy, sandhi is the policy to be followed. It's something that you also do currently practice. When one is weaker than the enemy, the sandhi is the policy to be followed, the policy of peace. But if it is stronger than him, it is better to, then that would be vigraha. But if both are equal in power, it is better to follow asana. Asana is the right policy, the policy of remaining quiet. I need not have to explain, giving examples, but then you can very well imagine the diplomatic order. With whom are you becoming quiet? With whom are you becoming, we are showing our power, with whom we are trying to have peace or sandhi. With whom are you creating new allies? All that it's, suppose you talk about the Quad today and the all kinds of new, international, collaborations happening across. That gives enough hint towards the kinds of things that I am talking about now, that the three kinds of rules that were in place then are very much there today in today's context when it comes to diplomacy. There was, even with respect to war and conquest, there was clear-cut guidelines or policies. Conquest was considered to be of three types. Dharma Vijaya, which is a righteous conquest, or Lobha Vijaya, greedy, or Asura Vijaya, demonical. So even today also we see, when it comes to conquest, more or less similar kinds of conquests are in place in today's context as well. When it comes to war, again, he talked about Prakash Yuddha, or open fight at a place and time indicated. Kuta Yuddha, concealed warfare, which has become the order of the day. Or Taslim Yuddha, silent fighting, implying thereby that we are using secret agents for enticing enemy officers or killing them, and so on and so forth. That also is very much in place in today's context or in the contemporary context. So these are some of the key elements of Kautilya's Arthashastra, which just I thought of highlighting, because I don't like to discuss these things in detail, and moreover, I am not a person of politics or strategy, or for that sense, any other areas that were law, justice, and all that. So I may not be the right person to comment on each of these aspects. But these are certain things which can be directly or indirectly linked to even economics, because as I said, economics is just not, it is not an untouchable field. It is very much linked to politics. It is very much linked to diplomacy. It is very much linked to law and war and so on. So that way, the elements or the key aspects which I just discussed may have a direct or indirect bearing on the economic policies or the economics discourses that we talk about. So what I shall do now, I shall discuss Kautilya's Arthashastra and its relevance to contemporary economics. I mean, to what extent it can be linked to contemporary economics. Though economics as a field is very dynamic, it keeps changing. Even all that we studied in maybe 20, 30, 40 years back have also been questioned today. Even there was a time when we said, we borrowed the entire idea of economics from classical and neoclassical thinkers, neoclassical economists, and believed that economic agents are rational entities. All the decisions they take are based upon rational considerations. But today, we talk about behavioral economics, where we find or we contest this kind of an ideology, this kind of a discourse or an approach, wherein we say that all the decisions that we take as economic agents may not be rational decisions because they are not based upon rational considerations. This is basically because we as economic agents are not rational agents. We are not always applying our rational considerations while undertaking decisions. So that way, a new branch of study which has cropped up called behavioral economics, and that is gaining ground these days, contesting the neoclassical approach of rationality or rational consideration. So having said that, whether it is behavioral economics or rational economics, the neoclassical economics which is based upon rational consideration, there are followers of both even in today's context also. And moreover, there are certain points of convergence. There are certain points of meeting of both the ideas as well. So I'll consider contemporary economics as one, regardless of the approaches that we talk about, whether it is behavioral economics or neoclassical economics based upon rational consideration. So the contemporary economics on the one side and Kautilya's Arthashastra on the other side, are they interrelated? Has contemporary economics borrowed anything from Kautilya's Arthashastra, or they are completely different? There is nothing to learn from Arthashastra and contemporary economics, which is primarily based upon Western ideas. They have nothing to do with the Arthashastra. That is what we'll have to see. So what I would like to advocate here is that there is a lot of the economic principles Kautilya talked about has application or has direct relevance to contemporary economics and has been also directly applied even in today's context, which we do not consider as, or Kautilyan economics. We consider that as neoclassical economics or some other kinds of economics. To begin with, one is demand and supply, and this is something that we all talk about. In all, the moment we talk about economics, we begin with demand and supply as the fundamental principles or the pillars on which a large portion of economics, large part of economics rests. But then what does this demand and supply in the contemporary economic sense talk about? We say that the prices of the goods and services of the factors are determined by the demand and supply. It is the intersection between the demand and supply that determines an equilibrium price. If for any reason the demand increases given the supply, the price increases. If demand decreases given the supply, the price will decrease. And similarly, if demand is constant and the supply changing, then accordingly the price also changes. And interestingly, Arthashastra also talks about the same thing. Kautilya's concepts are familiar with the modern days of economics of demand and supply, where we say that the price is determined by the intersection of demand and supply. Not only that, there is also another important aspect there. That is that who should fix the price? Okay, demand and supply it is the intersection between demand and supply that will determine the price. Will the price be administered, or the price will be decided by the market forces, independent of state's intervention? During that time, it was king's intervention. In today's context, we say it is the government's intervention. The states or countries, the government in place which has to intervene. So should we have an administered price, or we should have a price which is market driven? So there are still debates on this. We followed in India for quite some time. For many commodities, we followed an administered price. Today, we have opened up the economy. We are talking about free market economy, where the prices are being decided by the market forces on the basis of demand and supply. Government doesn't intervene in the free play of market forces. And that was also the philosophy then when Kautilya was prescribing certain policies for the pricing. As he said, king should not arbitrarily fix the price of a product without regard to its supply and demand situations. So exactly same thing happens in today's context. We say that if the price of a product is rising, it must be rising because there is supply constraint or there is greater demand than the supply. So according to him, without proper consideration of demand and supply, price cannot be at equilibrium. And unless that happens, welfare of the consumers and producers cannot be maximized. This is a debatable issue, because we say when the price is left to the market forces, and there is private monopoly in existence, there is a possibility that the price is distorted in favor of the producers and the consumers are at disadvantage. But even then, there is a large body of literature which is in support of the invisible hand, that is the market force, which should be given a free hand to operate independent of government intervention to fix the price, so that ultimately both the consumers and producers could maximize their welfare. But as I said, that there is a possibility of monopoly to exist. The moment you say market has to determine, there is a possibility that monopoly, the market can be monopolized. There may not be perfect competition, what you say in economics. There may not be perfect competition. There may not be more than one player, one producer for a particular product. There may be only one producer. There may not be many producers. So if monopoly elements exist, then profit limit should also be fixed. So where perfect competition prevails, there is no need for government, or for that sense in Kautilya's time, it was the king or the state which was to interfere. The price was to be left to the market to be decided, as long as market was perfectly competitive. But if the market was not perfectly competitive, and during that time also monopoly elements were present, and Kautilya advocated for a profit limit, and businessmen were allowed to make a profit of 5 to 10%. So that way, market is given, the private players coexist with the public players. During Kautilya's time, there was coexistence of both private and public enterprises. There are private players, ownership over the resources by both private and public entities. And as a result, there is a possibility of monopoly power to come into existence sometimes in certain cases. And then there are strict rules as Kautilya advocated. And today also we are talking about the same thing. Whenever there is monopoly, we also have Monopoly Restricted Trade Practices Act, MRTP Act, for example, we talk about. Or for that sense, you have in different countries, different types of business policies are there to restrict the monopoly operation. So state-owned business and private business were seen during Kautilya's era. And obviously, if there are both state-owned enterprises and the private business enterprises, there would be a possibility of conflict of interest between them. And Kautilya prescribed the policy to remove these conflicts via some parity in the prices, in such a way that it should not stifle the incentive for the private sector. So this is something very important. Even today also we are doing the same thing, that we are trying to bring in parity. Whenever government has to intervene, government is trying to intervene, but it's also ensuring that the private sector is not disincentivized. Private sector is given enough freedom to operate so that they are encouraged to, they are inclined to undertake newer and newer investments. Otherwise, they go to other countries. Wherever they get more freedom, they go there. So if private enterprises are to be promoted, then you need to also give them some freedom. But at the same time, when the public enterprises are there along with the private enterprises, there are possibilities of conflicts of interest, and then prices are to be brought to a level where both can be compared. But while doing so, it must be ensured that the private interests are not hampered to the extent that they leave the business. So, to sum up, I would say, but Kautilya's Arthashastra suggested that states should not dictate the prices without consideration of a few things. One is the cost of production. And it is also true today. The cost of production is the primary factor to determine the price of the product. If higher is the price, higher is the cost of production, higher would be the price of the product. The price is always cost inclusive. Second one is the ratio of supply to demand. And I was talking about that. How would the price be determined? The price of a product is determined on the basis of demand and supply. You have a demand function, you have a supply function. So it is the relative strength of the demand and supply that determines the price. And also a reasonable level of profit. A markup over the cost is also to be ensured so that the enterprises carry out the business as desired. Otherwise, there won't be business. So this is something that we also do today, as it was advocated then. So as you can observe here, there are a lot of similarities between what the contemporary economic thinking or thought and the Arthashastra as far as demand and supply, the price determination, the allocation of resources, because within the price determination comes the allocation of resources. Within the allocation of resources comes demand and supply. And so it is one package. And more or less, there is a convergence of ideas between the contemporary economics and the Kautilyan economics. He also says that in a situation of overproduction, state is expected to intervene and centralize the sales so that the price should not fall from a certain minimum level, which is called price floor. I think this part has been covered by Professor Mishra, that when there is overproduction, there is a possibility of the price to fall, but the state has to interfere at this point in time to ensure that the private enterprises, their interests are not hampered to the extent that they are completely disinterested to undertake the business in the future. Coming to international trade, yet another very important component of economics. What you observe is that Kautilya was very clear about the role of the international trade. He was a strong proponent of international trade, both export and import. The international trade as a branch of study in economics, when you talk about as a field of study within economics, it begins with the proposition whether we should undertake international trade or not, whether the economy should be opened up, or we should believe in a closed economy, no trade to happen. And in fact, it was Kautilya, possibly who was the first person to talk about this, that it is necessary on the part of the state to recognize the importance of international trade of both goods and services, because international trade, according to him, is a major vehicle for increasing a state's wealth and that of its subjects. So and today we're talking about something called gains from trade. We talk about whether you should undertake the trade or not, advantages of trade, terms of trade, and Kautilya emphasized on all these different aspects, which find place in today's international economics books. According to Kautilya, merchants are important for trade. But since they didn't generate any form of material wealth, price distortions would arise. that would result from merchants' high profit margins or due to other speculative behavior. And that has to be controlled. So that means when there is merchandise trade to happen, there is a possibility of price distortion to be brought about by the merchants through trade just to earn more profits. And under these situations, the state has to intervene to come up with strict measures, strict regulations. And today also we are exactly doing the same thing. When it comes to the trade, to control the profit margin, I mean, exorbitant prices that the trade involves in order to earn more profit, that is also being controlled through certain trade policies, export and import policies. Kautilya was not concerned with the balance of payments equilibrium. That means when you talk about today in international economics, if anybody is familiar with that, must be knowing that we always say that balance of payments is always balanced. So implying that there are two accounts, there is a current account, there is a capital account. If there is a deficit in the current account, that is met by the surplus in the current capital account, that means by borrowing. Okay, so that was not an issue in Kautilya's scheme of things. He did not bother about the equilibrium part, that as I'm talking about, that if there is a imbalance in one account, that would be taken care of by the other account, the capital account. That means borrowing from another country or an international agency. If there is deficit in the trade account, that would be made by the surplus in the capital account. But then he advocated for both imports and exports of goods and services. And according to him, import is oriented toward wealth creation. Import is necessary for wealth creation in the state in question, in the kingdom in question. And the commodities which are not produced domestically or are available at a high price are to be imported. And that could happen because of the high cost of production within the country. So there comes in the principle of comparative advantage, which Ricardo developed later on. There are, as I was talking about, the advantages of trade. There are two important theories you talk about. One is called the absolute advantage, as Adam Smith, the father of economics, suggests, and the other one is called comparative advantage, which is what Ricardo suggested. And the principle of trade that Kautilya advocated was based upon comparative advantage. He visualized comparative advantage in trade. Not the absolute advantage, it was comparative advantage. And this principle was used in advancing exports to regions and areas generating profits, while unprofitable areas were avoided. So basically, that when we talk about comparative advantage, it is that, I mean, different from the absolute advantage. Just to tell you in a very simpler term, that in absolute advantage we argue that any product which can be produced at a relatively lower cost in one country should be produced there and exported to the other country. We should not import any such product from another country which can be produced at a relatively lower price in the country in question. That is the principle of the absolute advantage. Whereas comparative advantage tells little different things. It tells that maybe everything is cheaper. You can produce all the goods in a particular country at a relatively cheaper rate, at a lower cost of production. But then, if producing more of X, even if X and Y both can be produced at a cheaper rate here in India compared to USA, then possibly, if X is giving more advantage to than Y, then it is better that the country's resources are utilized in producing more of X or only of X and exporting these goods to other countries and importing Y from other countries. And this is exactly what even Kautilya advocated for. He did not say that everything is to be imported from abroad, which has a high cost of production within the country. He said that the goods which are relatively, the comparative advantage between the, basically we bring in the opportunity cost here, opportunity cost of producing goods. So that opportunity cost guides the producers to decide what to produce and what not to produce and what to trade and what not to trade. And that is what Kautilya also advocated then. And so it shows that, and this is something which still remains a very powerful principle or mechanism when it comes to undertaking trade between nations or across nations. However, exception was made in the case of exporting commodities to possible future allies or strategic trade partners. Sometimes we also compromise on this principle, even today also, because of political economic considerations or diplomatic considerations. And today also we are doing the same thing. If even if you have the comparative advantage over certain things, but the diplomatic considerations do not allow you to produce that good, rather you decide to import that from other country, and in return you export some other goods to that country. So that is also happening. And then also the same thing he talked about. And also along with the trade, he advocated for both import and export. At the same time, he also advocated for trade tariffs, price subsidy, and trade control system. Both import duties and export duties. So to facilitate, and all these were directed towards facilitating and safeguarding the trade activities. The basic idea behind trade tariff was to earn revenues for the state. Why do we levy taxes? As Kautilya suggests, it was to earn revenues for the state. The state's wealth is to be increased. So that was the idea behind imposing tariffs. And wherever needed, price subsidy was also given. Terms of trade also had an important role in the trade system. The import price and export price difference that you talk about, the price of export versus the price of import, the terms of trade is decided accordingly. So that also was emphasized. He realized the importance of the terms of trade and how that can decide what to trade and what not to trade and all that. That also is something that is studied today in contemporary context in international economics. Strategic partners were to be attracted through bilateral agreements. Particularly, that what you can very well understand what we exactly mean by strategic partners in today's context. So they have to be, and that is what he also said, that strategic partners. Your USA could be your strategic partner, or Australia could be your strategic partner, or Japan could be your strategic partner. So when it comes to strategic partners, there would be bilateral agreements. That's what exactly we are doing now. And even we go for trilateral or even more than that kind of agreement these days. And this bilateral agreement would lead to two-way trade policies, where there would be competitive advantage favoring both the nations. The comparative advantage principle was to be followed. And interestingly, Kautilya also advocated for attracting foreigners who possess good technical and other economic development of the land. Today we are talking about the opening of the economy, and then it is the export and import of not just the goods, but also the services. So even then also, Kautilya talked about opening up the economy where not only the goods are to be exported, even the services are to be exported. The technical manpower is also to be exported or imported. Another important aspect of Kautilya's international trade doctrine is that he suggested for heavy taxes for the luxury imported goods, the luxurious imported goods, the goods which are considered luxury for the people. Whereas the taxes are to be lower or lessened for the essential goods which are to be imported. That is what even today we are following. I have talked about, these are the, there is a repetition of the things. So further what, as I have already said, Kautilya suggested for the use of tariffs, both import and export duties, primarily as a source of revenue for the state or for the monarch, rather than as a mechanism for altering trade patterns. It's not that you don't like to trade something from one country, so increase the import duty so that the importers will be discouraged to import those goods. It was not the intention. The intention was to earn more revenues. And the import rates generally ranked between 4 to 20% during that time. So if I now put this, I mean, given having discussed the two different aspects, one is demand and supply, the other one is the international trade, and all other discussions I made related to the modern economics vis-a-vis Kautilyan economics, we can see some areas of convergence between the two, some areas of divergence between the two. And if I put them in perspective, they would be the following. If we talk about modern market economy, mostly modern economy across the globe has become a market economy, market-based economy or market-driven economy. So there is, as you know, there is private ownership over capital and other resources. So resources are basically owned by the individuals, both capital and labor and all other resources we talk about. Whereas during Kautilyan era, or in the Kautilyan scheme of things, there is ownership over the resources, and the resource ownership is by both private and the state. India follows a model of a mixed economy where there is ownership of resources, ownership over resources both by the private enterprises and public enterprises. Ownership of resources by the private entities and the public entities, but it is not true in all the countries. Today is the era of the privatization, market-driven economy. So from that perspective, when you look at it, we're going more towards market-driven economy, free market economy. But as Kautilya talked about, the coexistence of both private and public enterprises, capital and resources, other resources are owned by, in Kautilyan scheme of things, are owned by both a state and individuals or the citizens. When it comes to price system, as I have already discussed, it is used to allocate resources in the economy by the forces of demand and supply. As you know, the price, when you fix the price, it helps you to allocate the resources. The price, the resource which price has price rises, its demand decreases, and vice versa. So allocation of the resources is very much linked to the price. And more or less similar kind of a pattern was there during Kautilyan time. Price system was used to allocate resources in the economy by the forces of demand and supply, but under government supervision and intervention. Today, we are not advocating for government intervention much in the free play of market forces. So there is some deviation, but then there was a time, as I told you, in India, we had government intervention in the free play of market forces. When it comes to entrepreneurship, it was in today's context, it is based upon invisible hand that market force decides the entrepreneurship, and it is based upon the risk-taking ability of the individuals who becomes an entrepreneur, the person who is ready to take the risk. The entrepreneurial, I mean, there are theories of entrepreneurship where we say that there is a theory called risk-bearing theory of profit. So a person who is ready to take the risk is likely to earn more profit. So entrepreneur is one who has one important trait, that is the ability to take the risk. And when it comes to entrepreneurship under Kautilyan system, there is also an invisible hand, but then there is some government control. And the risk taking, I mean, there was some kind of check and balance from the government upon the entrepreneurs, no matter whether it is a state-owned enterprise or a privately owned enterprise. The nature of competition, there is rivalry between buyers and sellers on the market, which encourages efficient and wise use of resources in the production process. Whether there is perfect competition, on the other side there is imperfect competition. In the imperfect competition, you don't have that much of efficiency that you talk about, because this efficiency, how you interpret it, is that is subject to debate. But if there are a large number of buyers and sellers, market can be efficient. That is what is believed. But the moment the number of sellers decreases, possibly the resource allocation could be distorted. Possibility of efficiency in the market could be difficult. The possibility of attaining efficiency in the market could be questionable. Coming to Kautilyan market economy, there is also rivalry between buyers and sellers, but then again there is a control of the state. So as you observe, and then similarly, if I go to the next point, existence of moral hazard problem, in both, there was a moral hazard problem, that we talk about, where moral hazard is moral hazard and adverse selection problem that we talk about in today's context, be it in the particularly that arises because of the asymmetric information. So that also existed then, and that also exists today. And then but then there was a controlled moral hazard problem that was there then during Kautilyan era, unlike what we have today, because there is greater degrees of asymmetric information today. Then we have today we have more kind of an efficient market economy we talk about, but then when Kautilyan economics was advocated for, it was more about moral market economy. It had some degree of ethics to come in to play its own role, so that there comes in the role of the state, the justice system, the legal system, and all that we talk about. But today we are advocating more for an efficient market economy, where the market is given a free hand to operate independent of any intervention, and we believe that that would be automatically efficient. Now, I'll talk about the principles of taxation, and then with that, I think I'll one more aspect I'll discuss, and then I shall conclude my discussion. So when it comes to taxation, do you have any question, by the way, before I proceed with these topics, these different other aspects of economics? Do you have any questions to ask me? Okay, if you have no questions, let me continue. So when it comes to taxation, this is something which Professor Mishra has discussed in the previous class. But then I'll highlight a few other important points which possibly he did not touch upon. First is that when it comes to taxation, Kautilya again was very clear about that. It is necessary for the creation of wealth for the state and also for the well-being of the subjects. But the taxation system should be fair and efficient, which will supply revenue to the state or the king without stifling the economic growth. Because one can consider tax to be something which would disincentivize incentivize the economy. But Kautilya talks about a tax system which is fair and efficient, which is very much necessary for the state to run and provide welfare to the people, enhance the economic welfare of the people. But it should not be at the cost of the economic growth. And Kautilya's principles of tax are more or less based upon, or they're in line with what Adam Smith talks about as the canons of taxation in his Wealth of Nations. In fact, Adam Smith talked about the first four principles of taxation or the canons of taxation. The canon of equality. The tax system should be such that it is based upon the principle of equality, implying that we should impose taxes in such a way, or it should be based upon the ability to pay. Those who are able to pay more, capable to pay more taxes, those who have more income should pay more taxes, those who have less income should pay less taxes. Equality doesn't mean that everybody should pay same amount of tax. Equality, the canon of equality implies that the taxes are to be decided on the basis of the ability to pay. So it is, in a sense, you can say it can be based upon the we follow something called progressive tax structure. So that is based upon the principle of equality. Canon of certainty. You know that you are going to pay the tax, this much of tax, when to pay, how to pay, where to pay, and how much to pay, on which commodity you are going to pay the tax, whether there would be a direct tax, there would be an indirect tax. So that certainty must be there. That is yet another very important principle. Canon of economy, which talks about the cost involved in the collection of taxes and the entire tax machinery which is involved in it. It should economize its resources and the tax system should be such that we are economizing our resources. And the last one, as far as Adam Smith's canons of taxation are concerned, is canon of convenience. We also must ensure that it is convenient on the part of the people and the administrators to pay and collect taxes. So the convenience is also a very important principle. But in addition to this, what Kautilya also advocates, they are of very important relevance even in today's context. One is taxing power is to be limited on the part of the state. He talks about the tax and how much the power the state must enjoy when it comes to imposing taxes on the citizens. It should be limited, not that the state would enjoy unlimited power as far as tax is concerned. The tax, so the second one is the tax should not be felt to be heavy. So then we should, as I said, that it should be based upon the principle of equality, ability to pay principle, which must ensure that the tax is not very heavy and tax increases should be graduated. Not that you increase the tax overnight and there is a huge gap between different kinds of the taxes that have been imposed on different kinds of goods. So there is it must be graduated in the sense that the gradual it is rising, or across different commodities the taxes are such that they are comparable and all that. Kautilya recognized that a prosperous and stable kingdom must be founded on a well-developed and administered tax system. So there must be a treasury. I was talking about Kosa. It must be managed properly by the administrators, by a team of people who are efficient, who are capable of running it. They must be aware of the canons of taxation. They must understand these principles of taxation and they must follow these principles. And his advice on the ideal tax system was based on achieving 4 different objectives. They are gaining as much tax revenue as possible for the king. As much tax revenue as possible, because one of the major sources of the revenue for the state, as Kautilya advocates, is the tax revenue. Next one is promoting economic growth and development within the kingdom. So tax system should be such that it must promote economic growth and development, not it should stipulate. Third one is it must ensure that resources are used efficiently. There should not be tax distortion, which would lead to misallocation of resources. As typically we talk about this in economics, that an efficient tax system may lead to efficient allocation of resources. Distorted tax system would lead to inefficient or misallocation of resources. What I mean by this is that something which is scantily available and you have a lower price on that product, what will happen? That will be finished soon. So what we need to do? We need to price it higher compared to the one which is plentifully available. We talk about something called water diamond paradox in economics. Water is plentifully available in relation to its demand. So it is priced lower compared to diamond. So similarly, when you talk about allocation of resources, it has something to do with the demand and supply of the resources. And the price is very much linked to them. And price is linked to the tax. Particularly the indirect taxes we talk about. Because the indirect taxes are shifted to the consumers, to the end users. If you levy a tax on a product, the sales tax, for instance, the burden of the tax is shifted to the end users. So the prices increase as a result of that. As you see today, the petrol price is increasing because of the increase in the taxes that the states and the center collect. These are indirect taxes. Finally, we are paying the price of the petrol is what we are paying, and the price is decided on the basis of the taxes. And this could lead to misallocation of resources. So this is something that must be ensured, that there is allocation of resources efficiently. Efficient allocation of resources. Last one is applying taxes that are fair and just. Where to levy the taxes, where not to levy the taxes, how much of tax is to be levied, all that. Who should be levied the taxes, who should not be levied the taxes, all that is clearly mentioned by Kautilya. Like for instance, he talks about the goods, as I have already said about luxury goods. The luxury goods are to be heavily taxed. compared to the essential goods. Today we talk about something called temptation goods. So the temptation goods are to be heavily taxed compared to the essential goods. And that is what also Kautilya advocated then. So in Kautilyan state, revenue came from two different sources. One is the sales of the minerals, timber, and agricultural products. These are the major things, including fishery, and the taxes from both direct and indirect sources, taxes from private income, wealth, and products, including foreign trade, that is export and import duties. Now, the last but not the least, which I thought of sharing with all of you, is the labor theory of value. Yet another very important aspect of economics, contemporary economics, on which we debate. What would be the wage system? Who would fix the wage? How much would be the wage? Would the wage be fixed by the market forces, or employer would fix the wage? Would there be a minimum wage? And so on. And there is a theory called labor theory of value, which has been suggested by many, advocated by many. And if I talk about Adam Smith's labor theory of value, it has a lot of resemblance with what Kautilya has advocated for. What Kautilya advocates is that a wage system which rewards workers for the economic value they have created and encourage them. And he encouraged, what he says is that if we are having a wage system which rewards workers for the economic value, that will encourage them to work harder and more efficiently. So the labor theory of value, it is about how to value labor, how to fix the wages. The wages, as Kautilya suggests, there are three distinct components that would determine, or that must determine, the market value of labor, or the wage. That is the level of skill required. That is the human capital. What kind of skill set one possesses. Today we are talking about something called human capital. What kind of education you have received? What kind of skill set you have got? What kind of training you have got? Second one is labor hours worked. How many hours of work you have contributed? And the third one is units of output produced, which is basically the labor productivity, the productivity of labor. So these three should be the determinants of the wage. And this is what even today we are also following, though we see there is presence of labor union, there are some arbitrary wages being fixed, and there are other issues. Sometimes we talk about market to be given a free hand to operate when it comes to determination of wages. And in some other context, we see that there is wage rigidity. Then there is trade union or the labor union. The wages can be flexible, cannot be flexible downward. It can be flexible upward only. We have also seen. But in some other context, you have seen wages are flexible downward and also upward, depending upon the situation. If I quote, or I cite two different examples of Kautilyan economics with respect to wages, what he says is that, as it is reported in two different works, one by Samasastri and the other one is by Nagarajan. According to Samasastri, as to wages not previously settled, the amount shall be fixed in proportion to the work done and the time spent in doing it. That means it is to be based upon the two principles that I have already talked about. The labor hour worked, out of the three principles, labor hour worked, and the third one is units of output produced, the labor productivity. And when it comes to wages, which are not previously settled. The employers shall obtain 1/10 of the crops grown, a herdsman's 1/10 of the butter clarified, and a trader 1/10 of the sale proceeds. Sorry, the first one is the cultivator. I mean, who would obtain how much? A cultivator shall obtain 1/10 of the crops grown, a herdsman 1/10 of the butter clarified, and a trader 1/10 of the sales proceeds. Further, when we look at the works by Nagarajan, what he talks about is that payment to labor is not contingent on marketing of goods. Whether you have been able to sell the goods or not, the wages are to be paid to the workers. So it has a very important welfare implication. So having said all this, I would like to conclude by stating the fact that Arthashastra, or for that sense, Kautilya's work on economics in particular, has a lot of contemporary importance. And particularly, as we have observed in the context of pricing, allocation of resources, the tariff, fixation of tariffs, international trade, the principles of international trade, and the fixation of wages, as well as taxes. We see that these are certain important instruments of economics which you study, which you debate on. And in almost all these areas you see, Kautilya has made enough adequate contribution, which possibly has not found a place in modern economics. It requires much greater probe, much in-depth research to really understand how Kautilyan economics can be compared with the contemporary economics or the economics of the past beyond Kautilya, and then how we can give credit to Kautilya. In which respect can we give credit to Kautilya as the first proponent of certain principles of economics, which possibly we have not yet recognized. Just to substantiate this particular point which I have said, to look at some of the writings that have been made in the past, some works that have been carried out on Kautilya's Arthashastra. One such seminal work was carried out by Mayer, a German Indologist and translator, who translated Arthashastra from Sanskrit to German in 1927. And according to him, Arthashastra is just not a book, but a library of ancient India. Possibly, this was something that was driving the statecraft at that point in time. It was the principle of statecraft at that point in time for centuries together, possibly. And it is to be probed, it is to be further researched upon to understand or to contest. If there is anything to contest, anything to decipher, there is a need for more research to be carried out on this particular aspect. Similarly, a senior researcher, Okuyama of Japan, has mentioned that geopolitics and its practice has always been present throughout history, and one earliest example of this is Kautilya's Arthashastra. So the geopolitics that we talk about, what you mean by geopolitics is all about, when you talk about this international order in today's context, that was there then, and that is there today as well. And so Kautilya's Arthashastra is a testimony to that we had the geopolitics in and it's that was present then also during Kautilyan era and beyond that, and it is also present there. So there is a lot to learn from this book to see what we can advocate for in today's context, so that we may find certain solutions to certain problems. Adam Watson considers Arthashastra for being a major theoretical analysis of international relations, a fusion unparalleled in any extant literature, as he talks about. So that means same thing. I mean, as I just said, that the geopolitics that you talk about, the international relations constitutes a very important component of Arthashastra. It is all about how a state has to have establish the relationship with other states, other kingdoms, and this is something that gets a place in international studies today, and we have a lot to learn from Adam Smith. The Kautilya Arthashastra. Ellen Rangarajan, who was in fact translated, edited, and rather interpreted Kautilya's book, who was a diplomat, Indian diplomat. He has worked extensively on Arthashastra, and he has argued that insofar as the nature of human beings remains the same and the states behave in the manner as they always have done, Kautilya remains relevant. And if I conclude, I would say that some of the important maxims, classical maxims that Kautilya suggests are the following. What produces unfavorable results is bad policy. That means he was very much clear about the state's role in the day-to-day affairs of a state, the monarch's role or the king's role or the minister's roles and their policies. So bad policy will lead to unfavorable results. Good policies will result in favorable results. What he further has said in another, to quote, it is a translation obviously, when the advantages to be derived from peace and war are equal, one should prefer peace. A very powerful statement one has to really ponder over. Similarly, if the advantage to be derived from neutrality and war are equal, one should prefer neutrality. Again, another very important statement or another very important principle to follow in diplomacy, in international relations, in the state's own policies with respect to other states. And particularly state here means the country, a particular country, a sovereign that we talk about. So with this, I think I'll stop here. I have a few references of the suggested readings. I have mentioned here. You can find out these things. So these are all publicly available resources. So you can find out even one such writing is by these three authors. It was published in Indian Economic Review, published by Delhi School of Economics, which is a Springer publication. It was Kautilya's Arthashastra and a neglected precursor to classical economics. It's a beautiful piece of work on Arthashastra. Similarly, Ellen Rangarajan's Kautilya, the Arthashastra. This is a book which he has edited, rearranged, translated, and introduced. This has been published by Penguin. This would be of great relevance to understand what is this Arthashastra all about. And there are quite a few other writings on Kautilya's Arthashastra. So there are quite a few I have mentioned. Maybe you will follow. You can find few others from different sources. So with this, I stop. Yes. So if you have any questions, you may ask me now.
Sir, I'll stop the recording.
Yes, yes.